Can morality exist without sin? That is to say, can we have moral standards even without a supernatural lawgiver that we could conceivably rebel against? The answer is a definite yes, and I'm here to tell you why. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. Last time, Dr. Craig tried to argue that objective moral values require the existence of a God, although strangely enough, the one topic he never even hinted at mentioning was how God is supposed to have anything at all to do with the existence of objective moral values. He just said that traditionally moral values has supposedly been based on God, who supposedly is the greatest good, which presumes that the term good has some kind of meaning. But what that meaning is, or how it applies to God, or what God has to do with actually creating that meaning, he didn't discuss. He basically just said, well, where else could moral values come from? And I think we pretty much told him. So today, he's going to want to try and prove that a God is required in order to have objective moral duties. But before we get to that, I thought it might be interesting to share a quick story from my own experience. As many of you know, I used to be a Christian, and I don't just mean I went to church on Christmas and Easter. Jesus was the core and focus of my whole life, and everything I did, every life decision I ever made, was based on what I saw as my relationship with Him. My marriage, my career, my home and family, everything. So, as you might imagine, it was a major shock when I finally realized that Christianity is a myth. No joke, it was the emotional equivalent of getting hit by a fully loaded dump truck going 60 miles an hour. I felt absolutely flattened. And then, as I lay in bed thinking, it occurred to me that if they ain't no real God, that means there ain't no such thing as sin. And just like some of my commenters, I figured that meant there was no such thing as objective right and wrong, and I could do literally anything I wanted. I mean, after all, I'd spent years sitting in church pews listening to preachers telling me exactly that. Well, sir, it took me all of about 2 seconds to realize that no, in fact, that ain't true at all. Maybe they ain't no God, but I still got to deal with the police and my family and the neighbors and everybody else. If I break the law, the police is going to get me. And if I start lying to folks and treating them bad, they's going to give me a hard time about it. I can't even go around binging on sweets and alcohol all day, or my health is going to go right down the toilet and take me with it. So, kinda to my surprise, not having any God turned out not to matter one single bit. The only two things that really changed in my life, practically speaking, was that I could quit supporting the church with my time and money, and I could cuss if I felt the need. Other than that, my actual everyday moral standards didn't change one bit. 'Cause morality don't come from God, it comes from our relationship with other folks. Well, come to think of it, there was one more thing that changed. If I messed up and did something that hurt somebody else, I couldn't just pray about it and have Jesus forgive me. As an ex-Christian, if I mess up, I has to go make it right with the other person or persons. Jesus ain't going to take care of it for me. I has to be accountable on my own self. And speaking as an ex-Christian, I think things is better that way. It gives me a greater motivation to do right and helps fix things better if I stumble. So any way you look at it, things is better off without Jesus. Anyways, that was my experience. Now on to Dr. Craig. As I said, his next argument's going to try and claim that some kind of God is required in order for objective moral duties to exist. And he takes basically the same approach as he did with moral values. Quote, traditionally, our moral duties were thought to spring from God's commandments, such as the 10 Commandments. But if there is no God, what basis remains for objective moral duties? End quote. And it's kind of ironic that he lists the so-called Ten Commandments here on account of there ain't no Ten Commandments in the original Hebrew text of the Old Testament. I did a whole video on that, and I'll link it in the description. But the gist of it is that God gave Moses 10 discourses or 10 words on Mount Sinai. And that's words in the biblical sense of, and the word of the Lord came to so-and-so saying blah, 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 whatever. And these 10 words that God gave to Moses was his entire and exclusive covenant with the nation of Israel. And it says so explicitly right there in the text. But somehow folks has completely forgotten that, and they changed the 10 words into 10 commandments and try and make out that somehow the heart and soul of morality itself is summed up in only 10 commands. Meanwhile, the original 10 words contains instructions on how to beat your slaves and how to sell your daughters and how to put people to death for making incense that smells like temple incense. So no, the original Decalogue don't give us any kind of decent basis for moral duties, objective or otherwise. And by the way, it's worth remembering here that when Dr. Craig says objective, he don't mean objective in the sense of existing independently of anybody's personal perceptions and preferences. He means specifically that it ain't a matter of any one individual's personal opinion. And that gives him a ton of leeway in declaring things to be objective duties, even when they ain't. It ain't really meaningful, it's just a rhetorical trick he uses so that he can pull out the "that's just your personal opinion" card whenever anybody disagrees with him. As to what moral duties is based on, the answer is basically the same as with moral values. If you want to know what moral duties is based on, just look at who's enforcing them. 'Cause it ain't any God. Either they's enforced by real people, or they ain't actually duties at all. Remember, the whole point of having a society is that the benefits of participating outweigh the costs to the individual. Each person contributes a little, which creates a cooperative society in which each person benefits a lot. Our actual moral duties is just the investment that's required from each individual in order to make everything work out. And that ain't something that's dictated by anybody's individual personal opinions, even if they's claiming that they's getting these opinions from some kind of invisible, unfalsifiable supreme authority. As a strictly practical consideration, some things is going to work to promote a healthy cooperative society, and some things ain't. It's quote-unquote objective in the sense that it's something we has to learn from objective real-world experience. We can't just arbitrarily decide that might makes right, for example. There's been times in human history when folks has tried that, and the social impact of that kind of morality was bad enough that today we use might makes right as an example of a corrupt moral system. The problem is that we don't automatically know exactly which approach is going to work out for the best. There's a certain amount of trial and error involved, or what some old-timers like to call the school of hard knocks. And a lot of folks would rather not have to put in all the blood, sweat, and tears that's required to work out what the best moral standards is. They'd rather have easy answers, and that's where religion steps in. Some folks, of course, has malicious motives and sees religion as an easy way to fool folks and manipulate them into acting against their own best interests. But even without malicious motives, it's easy for folks to turn religion into a social construct that serves to reinforce arbitrary systems of political control. Anytime you have a supreme authority that nobody else can see and hear, you has a huge amount of flexibility in interpreting what it is that he really wants. And that gives you tons of room to let your own personal opinions, prejudices, and preferences slip in, which is going to have an impact on the moral duties that you claim your God wants to impose on other folks. And just to make matters worse, claiming that you get your authority from a third party means that you ain't accountable for the particular duties you's trying to impose. You can make demands that require treating other folks with incredible cruelty, and not only can you deny any personal accountability for the abuse you're advocating, but you can even claim that anybody who pushes back against you is persecuting you just because they hate your God. So the reality is that religious morality has a huge potential for misuse if we let somebody's personal religion dictate our moral duties. But of course, once again, Dr. Craig don't want to hear any of that reality-based stuff. He wants folks to think, like I once did, that without God, there ain't no right and wrong. Quote, on the atheistic view, human beings are just animals, and animals have no moral obligations to one another. End quote. And this is largely false. Now, I'll grant you that you can find some species that ain't got the kind of social awareness and empathy to form complex societies, and that these non-social species ain't going to manifest any kind of moral patterns of behavior. And that makes sense because morality is something that springs from the needs and experiences of a society. But on the other hand, we do observe moral patterns of behavior in species that do rely heavily on social interactions for the survival and prosperity of the species, like, for example, wolves and various primate species. And of course, each species has its own unique needs and levels of cognitive functioning, so the patterns of moral behavior that arise may differ from those of humans, but they do have them. Dr. Craig uses the examples of lions hunting zebras and the mating habits of great white sharks to try and prove that lions and sharks ain't got the same moral standards as humans. But that's just misdirection. Lions and sharks ain't part of human society, so we wouldn't expect them to have human moral standards. Plus, of course, they ain't human. To Dr. Craig, though, these examples prove his point. Quote, so if God does not exist, why think that we have any moral obligations to do anything? Who or what imposes these moral duties upon us? Where do they come from? It's hard to see why they would be anything more than a subjective impression resulting from societal and parental conditioning. End quote. And them's all good questions, and it takes hard work to find the best answers, but that ain't what Dr. Craig wants. He wants an easy answer that just coincidentally gives him free rein to impose his own subjective values, biases, and preferences on other folks, on the pretense that they some kind of objective moral duty. In short, the answer he wants is God. But notice he mentions societal and parental conditioning. And this is part of where we get our morals from as individuals, even in the case of Christian morals. In fact, this is the primary means that Christianity uses to impose moral standards on folks, which is why they put so much emphasis on Christian education and church attendance. But this leaves out any consideration of the larger question of how parents and societies know which moral standards to impose, or rather, which ones they should impose. That's the more important question, and it's significant that Dr. Craig omits any mention of it. He wants us to just assume that God simply dictates what the moral standards is supposed to be. He don't want to raise the possibility that moral standards might come from anywhere else. And that's understandable because a secular study of morality does a much better job of explaining not just how we got the morals we got, but how we can learn to get better ones. But that ain't going to help maintain Christian supremacy. He goes on to list a few examples of some of the more egregiously harmful sexual behaviors that pretty much everybody would agree is wrong. And then he claims that without God, there's no way to show that such behaviors is quote-unquote wrong. And then he says this, quote, if there is no moral lawgiver, then there is no objective moral law that we must obey. End quote. His assumption here is that a moral lawgiver would have to be supernatural. But that's a false assumption. He might as well argue that if there is no supernatural speed limit giver, then there is no objective speed limit. And let's talk about that analogy for just a minute, because morality and speed limits has more in common than might be immediately obvious. Think for a minute about where speed limits come from. Does some celestial traffic cop arbitrarily dictate, "Thou shalt not exceed 25 miles an hour in residential zones"? Of course not. Were speed limits just a matter of somebody's subjective personal opinions? Wrong again. Speed limits are a way that society tries to balance the transportation needs of individual drivers against the consequences of driving a particular speed on a particular stretch of road. If and you has an elementary school with access to public streets, there's going to be certain times of the day during the school year when there's an unusually high likelihood of little kids walking out into the street without looking. So we lower the speed limit in the school zone in order to make the streets safer for the kids. We's trading off transportation efficiency for safety. And that's a good balance. And morality is the same way. Ideally, we want to maximize individual freedom because a free society gives individuals their best opportunity to prosper and contribute back to society in ways that benefit everybody. Certain behaviors, however, have consequences that outweigh the benefits of unlimited freedom. So we make the trade-off. We strike a balance. Objective consequences are the objective part of so-called objective morality. Or in other words, objective consequences, as understood and mediated by society, are the moral lawgiver. It don't take no invisible, unfalsifiable, supernatural dictator to impose them. We can do it ourselves just by careful consideration of the objective consequences of our actions. And by the way, let's talk for a minute about the job description for a supernatural moral lawgiver. Most believers ain't put too much time into thinking about how that would actually work because they just want to use this so-called moral lawgiver to rubber stamp their own opinions about how other folks ought to behave. But just think for a minute about how hard it would be to work out an actual, comprehensive, and above all, moral law. 10 Commandments ain't going to do it, even using the popular misconception about what the 10 Commandments is. Thou shalt not murder is good as far as it goes, but what circumstances precisely constitute murder? If and use the head of a big health insurance company and you make it so hard for folks to collect their benefits or get approved for treatment or pay for their meds and folks die as a result, is that murder? If and use the head of a pharmaceutical company and you raise the price of insulin so high that diabetics can't afford it and they die as a result, is that murder? If and use a landlord and you throw folks out on the street so you can get new tenants and charge them a higher rent, and folks freeze to death because they lost their homes in the middle of winter, is that murder? Morality is the human species learning how to get along with one another, and that means that morality is as complicated as the totality of all human social interactions. 10 billion commandments wouldn't be enough to cover every situation. And even if it was, how the heck's anyone supposed to remember all 10 billion? The best we can do is try and group situations together into general guidelines and then try to apply the general guidelines appropriately in each situation, depending on the context. Is it wrong to lie? Generally, yes. Is it wrong to lie to the Gestapo about where the Jews is hiding? Most folks would say no. Is it wrong to lie to ICE about where the immigrants is working? Same situation. 9 times out of 10, the notion of a moral lawgiver is used to excuse the mistreatment of others on the grounds that the lawgiver requires it. And the 10th time is to try and make an argument that God has to exist because he has to be the moral lawgiver. At this point, Dr. Craig introduces the standard apologist disclaimer whenever they's talking about morality. Quote, the question is not, can we recognize objective moral values and duties without believing in God? Rather, the question is, if God does not exist, do objective moral values and duties exist? End quote. And once again, even in the best case scenario for Dr. Craig, His argument boils down to an argument from creation myth. Assuming that objective moral values and duties do exist, his argument is nothing more than a case of a believer pointing to something in the real world and giving credit for it to an invisible, unfalsifiable, magical person or force. That don't explain where we get our morality from. That just uses morality to try and score some PR points for somebody's invisible, unfalsifiable deity. If we want to explain where morality comes from, we need to study society and social interactions and the objective consequences of those social interactions. That's where morality comes from, and that's where the objective dimension of morality comes from. It ain't a matter of any one person's subjective personal opinions, because individual subjective opinions ain't going to determine what outcome a social interaction's going to have. Personal opinions may contribute to the outcome, and very often they do, but simply having a personal opinion ain't enough by itself to dictate how other folks is going to respond to your opinion and your actions. So the fact that words and actions has objective consequences is enough to account for the fact that there's more to morality than personal opinions. It don't take no God to explain it. Dr. Craig goes on to tell another apologist's tale about a debate against a humanist that he supposedly won. The humanist in this case being Professor Paul Kurtz. Quote, Kurtz's point only shows that belief in God isn't essential to living a moral, optimistic life. It does nothing to refute my claim that if there is no God, then morality is just a human illusion. End quote. And there he goes again with that word illusion. Something can be a universal experience of every human being, reinforced by countless real-world experiences that's objectively verifiable, but if Dr. Craig can't claim that his God is somehow responsible, it's just an illusion. But he does raise a fair point, and that is that a lot of skeptics, especially in the rank and file, has a tendency to jump to the conclusion that apologists is saying that atheists can't be good. It's an easy mistake to make because in other contexts, like when they discuss in Romans 1, apologists do tend to argue as if atheists can't be good. But here in this specific context, they ain't saying that. And we need to pay attention and not give them an excuse to claim that we're misrepresenting their case. Anyways, to summarize, the answer is no. It don't take no God for us to have moral standards that's more than just the subjective personal opinion of any single individual. Social interactions has objective consequences, and them consequences exert pressure on society to adopt moral standards that maximize the positive outcomes and minimize the negative ones to the best extent possible. It ain't an easy process, and societies can and do head in the wrong direction at times. But over the grand scale of human history, moral standards tends to evolve in a positive direction, which is why slavery and genocide has come to be generally regarded as bad. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, Dr. Craig is going to finally take a look at something he should have started out with, the Euthyphro dilemma. And spoiler alert, he ain't going to have a good answer. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.